Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute most powerful biological engine on the planet. Now, like a lot of us, I used to just picture that basic textbook diagram, a plant sitting in the sun, simply making its own food. But the reality is actually a process much more complex, incredibly dynamic, and honestly, infinitely more crucial to our survival than just that. We're talking about a microscopic planetary-scale factory that literally sustains the breathable atmosphere of Earth.
But first, we need to address a massive paradox. Before we get into how plants keep us alive today, we really got to talk about the time they almost killed absolutely everything. I know, it sounds straight out of science fiction, but this is a very real, very wild chapter in our planet's history.
Picture this. Around 2.5 billion years ago, the Earth's atmosphere had practically zero oxygen. Life was just starting out in its most basic forms. But then, this organism called cyanobacteria comes along and starts photosynthesizing. And here's the crazy part. To these early photosynthesizers, oxygen was actually a toxic waste product. They were producing so much of it that they just kept expelling it into the air. This triggered what scientists call the Great Oxygenation Event. Pumping all that oxygen into an atmosphere that just wasn't used to it actually caused the entire world, the lands, the oceans, the whole shebang, to freeze over. It was literally an extinction-level event driven entirely by the exact same process we rely on to breathe today. Earth eventually adapted, sure, setting the stage for us. But it's incredibly ironic that our life-giving oxygen started out as deadly pollution.
All right, here is our roadmap for today's Explainer. 1. The ultimate planetary engine. 2. Discovering the invisible process. 3. Inside the chloroplast machine. And finally, number 4. Photosynthesis in a warming world.
Section 1. The Ultimate Planetary Engine.
So photosynthesis is an absolute multitasking powerhouse. It is definitely not a one-trick pony. Yes, of course, it generates glucose so the plant can feed itself, but it does so much more than that. The plant uses that glucose as literal physical building blocks to grow its own stems and leaves. It also banks that glucose, kind of like a battery, to build up energy reserves for those cloudy days when the sun isn't shining. And while it's doing all of this, it is pulling carbon dioxide right out of the air and producing the oxygen that allows every animal on this planet, us included, to actually survive.
Section 2. Discovering the invisible process. Seriously though, how did we actually figure out this invisible gas exchange was happening in the first place?
Well, it took a while, and our understanding really evolved over time. It all started back in 1771 with a chemist named Joseph Priestley. He put a mouse inside an enclosed jar, and obviously as the mouse breathed, the air became impure, and the poor little guy began to suffocate. But Priestley found that if he placed a sprig of mint inside that same jar, the plant somehow restored the air, saving our lucky little mouse. Then, a few years later in 1779, a scientist named John Ingenhouse ran over 500 experiments to prove that the plant could only pull this off if it was exposed to sunlight, and that only the green parts of the plant were doing the work. Fast forward to the mid-19th century, and physicist Robert Mayer finally hits the nail on the head. He identified that plants were literally converting radiant light energy from the sun into stored chemical energy.
Which brings us to Section 3. Inside the chloroplast machine.
Okay, let's zoom way in. If you look at a leaf, it has these tiny pores called stomata that let carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. But the real magic happens much deeper inside the leaf's cells, in an organelle called the chloroplast. When you peer inside one of these, you're looking at the ultimate biological factory floor. You'll find these stacks of membrane-lined discs called thylakoids. Surrounding those discs is this watery, clear fluid called the stroma. These two specific areas are where the entire manufacturing process actually takes place. Now, inside this factory, we've got this beautifully coordinated two-part system. First up, we have the light-dependent reactions happening right there in the thylakoid discs. This is where the sun's energy is harvested, water gets split, oxygen is released, and chemical energy is created in the form of molecules called ATP and NADPH. Then that energy moves out into the fluid stroma for part 2, the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle doesn't actually need light directly. Instead, it uses that ATP and NADPH energy we just created to manufacture actual physical carbohydrates out of carbon dioxide. If we break down that Calvin cycle a bit further, you'll see it operates exactly like a perfectly timed assembly line. Step 1 is fixation, where this vital enzyme called rubisco acts as the primary factory worker, literally grabbing inorganic carbon dioxide out of thin air and attaching it to an organic molecule. Next is reduction, where the energy from our ATP and NADPH is used to upgrade these molecules into a super high-energy sugar called G3P. And finally, regeneration. This step uses a tiny bit more energy to reset the whole assembly line so the cycle can just keep on running. To really wrap your head around this, it helps to view these two processes as a sort of automated interdependence. It's just like two factory workers running a relay race. The light reactions are out there doing the heavy lifting in the sun, generating the ATP, which is our energy currency, and the NADPH, which is our reducing power. They act as the runners, passing these vital chemical batons over to the Calvin cycle so it can do the heavy lifting of carbon fixation.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This is a very strict trade deal. The Calvin cycle is depleting the energy from those molecules, right? So it absolutely must pass the empty batons, which are now called ADP and NADP+, back to the light reactions. If the Calvin cycle slows down and stops returning those empty batons, the light reactions have nowhere to put their excited electrons. So if one stops, they both crash. The entire biochemical engine will just hit a brick wall. It really perfectly highlights just how absolutely fragile this biological machine is.
And just to put the sheer massive scale of this microscopic relay race into perspective, consider this number, 150 billion. It absolutely blows my mind. Through this totally silent, invisible process happening inside chloroplasts all over the globe, plants produce an estimated 150 billion metric tons of carbohydrate every single year. I mean, that is a scale of production that human manufacturing couldn't even begin to fathom.
Section 4. Photosynthesis in a warming world.
So now that we understand this delicate, perfectly balanced machinery inside the plant, we have to zoom back out to the macro level. How exactly is human-caused climate change impacting this intricate engine? Well, at first glance, the data presents a massive paradox. You might actually think climate change is good for plants. Rising CO2 causes what's called a carbon fertilization effect, which has actually driven a 12% increase in global photosynthesis over recent decades. More carbon means plants can partially close their stomata, which saves up to 20% of their water. Plus, warmer temperatures mean longer growing seasons. Sounds great, right? But these benefits are violently offset by a cascade of hidden environmental limitations. All that faster growth? It severely depletes the soil of crucial nitrogen. The longer growing seasons? They actually end up using way more water overall, leaving us with drier soils. And as we're about to see, the intense heat completely sabotages the internal factory.
Remember our buddy rubisco, the primary worker enzyme in the Calvin cycle that pulls carbon from the air? Well, as global temperatures spike, that crucial enzyme starts behaving like a stressed-out, overheated worker. It actually relaxes its physical shape. Its grip gets sloppy, and because of that, about 1/5 of the time, this overheated, lazy rubisco winds up mistakenly grabbing oxygen instead of carbon dioxide. This completely tanks the efficiency of photosynthesis and wastes the plant's hard-earned energy resources. If temps get high enough, rubisco can just completely deactivate.
And that brings us to a deeply, deeply concerning reality about our food supply. Because plants are taking up all this extra CO2 and growing way faster than the soil can supply them with nitrogen and other nutrients, we're seeing severe nutrient dilution. Studies are showing a 10 to 15% drop in protein concentrations in crucial global crops, stuff we rely on like wheat, rice, and barley. We're also seeing decreases in essential B vitamins and a huge loss of critical minerals like zinc, iron, and calcium. So our crops might be growing bigger and faster on a global scale for sure, but they are literally becoming less nutritious for the human beings eating them. This intricate relay race of photosynthesis has perfectly balanced our atmosphere for billions of years, but human influence is basically throwing wrenches straight onto the factory floor. It leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought for this explainer. If the very engine that powers our entire planet is being pushed to its biochemical limits, making our food less nutritious and stressing our global ecosystems, what exactly must we change to keep it running smoothly?